Welcome to Charles Whitaker, who is the Dean of Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. We're very excited to have him as part of our round 3 of Global Conversations, The View from 30,000 Feet. So welcome, Dean. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liza. I'm happy to be here.
Before I ask you about your background, tell us what it's like now doing your job.
Wow.
It's got to be extraordinary.
It is challenging, you know, first, my entire faculty had to learn to do remote teaching, and remote teaching in a discipline like journalism is pretty difficult. You know, journalism is all about going out and seeing the story, recording events in video and still photography. So we had to totally rethink our pedagogy and rethink the way we go about reporting. But fortunately, the industry has had to rethink reporting as well. So, but it's gone well, but it's difficult. The students actually would much rather be working in person. Our faculty would much rather be working with them in studios and in classrooms, but under the circumstances, it's going fairly well.
And you've got half the students coming back, is that correct?
Yeah, the first and second year students are not back, so we only have the third and fourth year students back.
I can only imagine the challenges you're going through. Yeah. So now let's flip and talk about you and talk about your background generally and in journalism in particular.
Where do you want to start?
I grew up
on the south side of Chicago, in Chicago. I'm the middle child of 3. And yeah, a single dad. My mother died when I was 11 years old of lung cancer.
Oh gosh.
So my father raised my 2 siblings and I pretty much alone. He never remarried.
Wow. And was what you're doing now your dream job? Because it would be a lot of people's dream job.
Not being dean. My dream job was to be a journalist. So when I was in 4th grade, I had an amazingly creative 4th grade teacher. Her name was Carol Nolan. And she said to me one day, I wrote this poem, and she said, "You should be a writer." And that was implanted in my head in 4th grade. And then in 5th grade, I'm thinking, I'm going to be a writer. And in 5th grade, I had to do a report based on a magazine. You have to take a periodical and do a report on it. And I chose Ebony magazine. And the report was by the then Paris bureau chief, a man named Charles Sanders, who I ultimately wound up working for when I went to work for Ebony magazine.
Oh, wow, that's so great.
Yeah, but he did a piece on African-American expatriates in Paris. And I was just so taken by that. And I said, wow, you mean as a journalist, you get to go and live in Paris and talk to amazing people? And so from 5th grade on, I sort of knew that I wanted to be a journalist.
Wow. And all it takes is one teacher, right?
It does, that's right.
So can you tell us, our audience, I know a little bit, but not everything, about why you're interested in ballet, how I pulled you into this conversation, and you have a history here.
So yeah, history that I don't even think you're all that aware of. But in addition to wanting to be a writer, at 9 years old, my parents put us all in this performing arts school, Sammy Dyer School of Theater on the south side of Chicago. And I took tap and tumbling. And actually my very first job was teaching, when I was 14 years old, was teaching tap dancing to 5, 6, and 7-year-olds. So
wow.
It was my very first job, my first paycheck. So from 9 to 16, I was in this performing arts school. I didn't do ballet, however, but you're in a studio, you're exposed to ballet. I sort of knew, I knew the terminology, I knew the 5 positions, I knew what an arabesque was, I knew what grand battement was. You sort of hear that all the while, and I didn't
orbit.
Exactly. I didn't think a lot about ballet, and I actually stopped going to the school at 16. I was then I'm a teenager, and guys are making fun of you and dance, and so I dropped dance altogether at 16 and ran track and played tennis instead. But then when I got in college, my junior year, I was dating a woman who was a dancer, and she convinced me to take a dance criticism class. I wanted to be mostly a movie or theater critic. That was my goal. My goal was to be Roger Ebert or Clive Barnes or Anna Kisselgoff, someone like that. and not so much Kissel Golf, because I didn't think as much about dance as I did about movies and theater. But this woman I was dating convinced me to take this dance criticism class. And it was the only dance criticism class that Northwestern offered. And it wasn't even in the journalism school. It was in the School of Communication, which had a dance program. And another amazing teacher, I can't remember her name, she sort of introduced me to Arlene Croce and Edwin Denby. We read the early criticism of Diaghilev and Lincoln Kirstein, who we think of as impresarios, but they actually wrote a lot about dance.
I did not know. That's
yeah,
really
they both wrote a lot about dance. So
okay.
Learning, and it just changed the way I thought about criticism, the way I thought about dance. When you're in journalism school, they are pretty disparaging about people who want to do something other than traditional, than politics, courts, and sort of serious journalism. So I was not particularly encouraged to do that, but that class sort of gave me a sense of, here's a possibility, not only here are the possibilities, but here is why this form of writing is important, how it can be scholarly, how it can really sort of provide a deep immersion into the domain and the craft. And that was a really important turning point in my life. I went off, became a traditional journalist, went to work for the Miami Herald, covering courts and cops and education and all the things that you typically do. And then I was in the Palm Beach bureau of the Herald and got to be the backup critic for Palm Beach, because Palm Beach had a lot of bad dinner theater. So I was doing a lot of, the Burt Reynolds dinner theater was in Jupiter, Florida, and I covered a lot of really washed up TV performers who came to the Burt Reynolds dinner theater.
That is a great story. I'm sure you saw some really, really bad theater.
It was really terrible. It was really awful. But that got me my next job in Louisville, Kentucky as a feature writer, but also deputy arts editor. And I was the backup to the dance critic and wound up covering the Louisville Ballet. And I actually went with them to Moscow on their tour. So I got back into dance writing a teeny bit as the backup there. So that's my kind of history in arts and arts cover. And then a little bit when I was at Ebony, I went with Dance Theater of Harlem to the Soviet Union as well, and covered a little bit of dance there.
You said something that surprised me, and it's very much before times. You said, I got to go to Moscow with the Louisville paper and then went to the Dance Theater of Harlem. Let's talk about how the massive structural changes in journalism have affected journalism in general, but in particular the arts. And then from there, I'd love to talk about how we can rethink arts journalism and what it will take to do that.
Well, we are in the throes of massive retrenchment, or actually obliteration of local news coverage. I mean, there was a time when every major paper, whether it was a regional paper or a national paper, had arts writers, and many of them also had dance writers. I mean, the Louisville paper had two dance writers, right? Because the Louisville had two papers, an afternoon paper and a morning paper. Both had dance writers. As local news has been obliterated by digital disruption, arts criticism is the first thing to go, and of the arts critics, the first ones to go are the dance critics. And so now we essentially have two dance critics in the country, Sarah Kaufman at the Washington Post and Gia Corliss at the New York Times. I mean, that's pretty much it. I don't know that there is, you could correct me if I'm wrong, you may know better than I don't know that there's another major dance writer who is only assigned to dance in any paper in the country anymore. There are arts writers now who will be pulled off of other, you may have a classical music writer who also gets to do dance, but there are actually no dance writers anymore. That is sort of a lost and dying breed. And it's among the first things to go as papers start to contract. And so we're losing a lot by losing that cadre of seasoned, well-established, and thoughtful dance critics.
Yeah, I mean, a great example, David Lyman, who's a fantastic dance critic with the Cincinnati Inquirer, you know, who's been doing it for 30 or 40 years. They pretty much cut that back. So except for Gia Corliss and Kaufman, there are a lot of people writing about dance, but it's a gig economy,
That's
which
right.
of course,
Exactly.
if I'm not getting this wrong, you can't travel.
That's right. Exactly. You cannot. That's right. You are basically covering when they come to town, and you're right. You're a freelancer who is covering when an editor thinks it's important for that to be a story. That's the other thing. I mean, many editors just don't see this as coverage, and so they are not assigning those stories.
Yeah. So let's flip a little to something that you mentioned before. You said, you know, sort of arts criticism is disparaged. It's not considered serious journalism. And, you know, as an impressionable young man, you want to do the thing that's cool, right? And cops are cool, and courts are cool, social justice is cool. You know, everybody wants to be Woodward and Bernstein. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then how this could be changed?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think first off, it requires a change in the thinking about what arts journalism is. You know, again, so many editors think of it as frivolous, as reporting that isn't as robust as reporting about other subjects and other topic areas. It's just sort of the icing on the cake. It's not what should really sustain the paper. It's not, or that they think it's not coverage that people really want. And we find that's absolutely not true. There was actually a whole audience that's actually hungering for more arts journalism. And this is a discipline that requires the same amount of rigor as any other beat. I often maintain that we have to treat the arts beats the same way we treat cops and courts. That means people should write about, it's more than criticism. It really is taking a deep immersion into the field and understanding both where the money flows, where it comes from, how the demography of the people who are in charge, as well as those people who are performing. The same way that you cover any other important beat, we should be covering arts in the same way, because it is important to our soul. I mean, arts are really, man does not live by bread alone, nor does he or she live by cops and courts alone. There are these other very, very important domains that we should be writing about and that our audiences want to read about.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you're making 2 points. One, we lose as a democracy, as a country, when we don't have a shared conversation around the arts. The second thing you're saying that really resonates, I think, with Dance Data Project is we have had a great deal of success getting the dance adjacent world, the business world in particular, to get interested in our stories. But dance critics don't seem to want to touch any of the economic, it's very much let's talk about, you know, the Balanchine performance that we saw yesterday and then the one from 50 years ago. But it almost seems to me, Dean, that the critics are having a conversation over the head of everybody else. And
I agree.
I don't know if, I'd love to hear what you think. I don't know if it's the training or.
I think it is the training. I don't think we train. Again, one of the wonderful things about this class that I took when I was in college was it just made me think about arts coverage differently. It was a very holistic class that kind of looked at art and dance in particular as a business. So we looked at companies. Yes, we looked at performance. Yes, we studied the history of the art form. And we don't train our arts writers to look at the domain that way. We train them to look at it purely with a critic's eye and not, again, treat it like a beat. You don't treat any other beat as though you parachute in one part of that beat and you ignore everything else. You know, you don't cover politics only from the standpoint of elections. You're also looking at budgets. You're also looking at staffing. You're looking at a lot of things when you're covering a municipal beat. That's the way you should cover an arts beat as well. The critics haven't been encouraged to do that. The editors don't think enough about the beat to press them to do that. And we on our side, as trainers of the educators of these new writers, we have not done enough to impress upon them how to cover these beats in a more holistic manner. And that's our failing as well.
Yeah. Raising my hand here for Dance Data Project, providing data for those journalism schools who are interested in exposing, their students to, well, let's write about the fact that the 10 largest dance companies in the United States are responsible for 61% of the combined budgets of the top 50. There's an economic term for that, right? It's called an oligopoly. So what does that mean? How you made a wonderful comment when we were talking about getting ready for the interview, and I don't want to feed it back to you, but I said, look, it just seems like there's so much sports journalism, and after a while, ESPN 465 and Barstool this and blog that. Why sports so much? And you said
they had advocates. There were a group of guys, and they were largely guys, who said sports journalism is important because when I was in school, sports journalism was as disparaged as much as arts journalism by the faculty. It's like, that's not serious journalism. We're not going to cover that. We're not going to teach you to do that. We're going to teach you to do bread and butter, again, municipal coverage, cops coverage, courts coverage. Sports is frivolous. We're not going to do that. But they had a series of advocates and high-powered advocates. We like to say we produce more sports journalists than any school in the country. Yep. Those high-powered advocates sort of said, this is important. We think there should be a program in sports journalism here. They've been proliferating all around the country. It also, journalism and journalism education has become pretty female dominated. If you go to almost any journalism school in the country, you will find that the enrollment is about 70% female.
Oh, wow, okay.
It is overwhelmingly female, unlike, it was about 60% female when I was leaving journalism school. When I entered journalism school, it was at the 50-50 point. By the time I graduated, it had tipped slightly female. It is even more overwhelmingly female now. And schools thought by creating sports journalism programs, that was a way to entice men back into journalism education. And it has done that to a certain extent. But yeah, it's purely about the advocacy of high-powered alums and others who said, we think sports journalism is a valid discipline to study and to train in, and we think that should be a part of your curriculum. And those advocates, have held sway.
So the next follow-on, obviously, is you mentioned that people come up and almost mumble in your ear in a dark corner, I'm really interested in the arts. Is it because it's considered too female and these women want to prove themselves in other areas? Is there some stigma in men covering the arts?
Yes, well, all of the above. I think it is considered too female. Again, I think it's considered too soft. I think there is something of a stigma about men covering the arts. But I should say one thing it's important to note. The internet has democratized this, right? There are tons of people out there. Yep. Covering arts in blogs, in all sorts of forums. What I find problematic about that, though, is a lot of it is dreck. I mean, a lot of it is just not very good. There are some good blogs, but a lot of it is not particularly good. A lot of it is just people pontificating, is just people kind of, bloviating about what they like and don't like. I do think there is, an art form to be mastered here that I think requires some study, some serious study, and some training, some guidance. And so, yes, we have there are a lot of people who just hang their shingle and are writing about the arts, on their own. And many of them are developing quite a following. So that has eased some of the stigma when people sort of don't have to have institutional sanctioning to do this work. They just sort of do it on their own. But again, within institutions, I think you're right. I think it is still considered, female, not serious. There is no, it's not robust enough to devote a lot of time and attention. Now we have a single arts criticism class in our graduate curriculum, and it tries to cover everything. I mean, it tries to cover everything from pop music to classical music to dance.
Yeah, and again, to me, that's just one branch of it, which is the criticism. Interestingly, to me, if you watch, and I hope you do, Makita Easter's interview with us from the LA Times and Sharon Basco from NPR, both of them have a broad journalistic background, and Makita actually had to explain quantum physics and particle, like quantum mechanics. And I think if you can do that, you probably have a pretty good, rigorous viewpoint on how to talk about the choreographic process. Similarly, Sharon Basco, who's done extraordinary work at Artery in Boston, has a science and technology background, and you wrote about cops and courts and everything else. So I hear you. Let's talk about diversity or the lack of diversity in ballet, not maybe in dance generally,
Sure.
and the stories that people choose to tell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it still is stunning and disappointing to me that there is so little diversity in ballet. And, and it's been pretty rigid. People have written about it here and there. We've sort of seen, there was a New York Times piece, I think Gia may have done it, about the lack of Black choreographers. People have constantly note the fact that, Misty Copeland is the first Black female principal at ABT. I don't know that City Ballet has had a Black woman principal ever. And they've had very few men. I mean, you have to almost go back to Arthur Mitchell. And that ballet has been so rigid in this regard, despite the fact that, again, we will get stories about it here and there, is pretty stunning. Some will say, it's the old stereotypes about what the right ballet body is, particularly for women, and it tends to be one that tends to be a stereotype that excludes women who, not just African American women, all sorts of women of different body types, yes. Right? Yes.
But yes. Narrowing of a narrowing of a narrowing. But yes, traditionally, and if you watch our interview with Erica Edwards, she talks about that. I mean, she made it into the Joffrey, but constant references, even the way she was trained was wrong because some teacher commented that her posterior was too large.
Exactly, that's right. And how do we break that? I almost put this to you. How do we get classical ballet to break out of that mold? And I don't want to blame Balanchine, but it seems as though there's a mold that is pretty cemented in ballet right now, and very few people seem willing to break out of it, and that is hurting diversity. And what that lack of diversity is doing is it's hurting audience development, right? It means that you have discounted whole swaths of the populace who could be your audience. You could be building this and confining yourself to this narrow swath of people because people are not seeing themselves represented on these stages. And that's so short-sighted. And I don't know how we break past that, but it's been rigid and unrelenting. And I wish more people would this seems to be a moment when, if it's going to be done, now seems to be the moment to do it, but I'm not seeing, tremendous movement on that front.
Yeah, I do. My analogy is that the ballet world, the ballet industry, because to your point, it is a business, seems intent on driving itself off a cliff. Some of the largest companies, I think of, here in we will see, people are covering their eyes, covering their ears, and going, nah, 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 and just hoping for the good old days, which weren't that great. And to your point, they're completely missing entire mass audiences. I also think, and this is deeply embarrassing for those who are making these decisions, that there's a misperception that the Black community, the Latino community, isn't interested in classically based dance, and they somehow can't understand it and don't have classical music training, which is hugely discriminatory and so wrong. I mean, Lizzo studied, classical
music. That's right, exactly.
Look at some of the biggest stars of hip hop, and they went to performing arts high schools, just the way you were saying. Yeah. The good news, though, I think, is that with the democratization, while we've lost a sort of shared interest, there's a lot of voices bubbling up, and I am hoping they're going to be heard. Anything else that you want to talk about?
Well, again, I just think it's really important going forward that we think about arts differently. I think within, the major media outlets, we have to treat this beat differently. We have to treat arts coverage as important. And again, that starts at the top. That starts with editors who say, this is important. I don't expect anyone to devote as many resources or deploy as many people to covering the arts as they are deploying to, the presidential election. Although I think sometimes we deploy too many people to that. But and we covered that. We covered that in a very superficial manner also. But that's a different topic altogether. I don't expect us to deploy as many resources or as many people to that, but to say that that this is so superfluous that we're going to completely turn a blind eye to it, or we are only going to rely on the occasional freelancer to do this coverage, does a disservice to our audience. And I think it requires editors to recognize that.
And I know that there's been a growing movement towards not-for-profit journalism. I don't know, maybe you can tell me whether Lookout Local or Texas Tribune or some of the more interesting of these not-for-profit initiatives, do any of them have arts coverage?
No, they do not. They're strictly politics, social justice, which are important. I'm not saying that these things, those are vitally important. What I'm saying is it's not an either or, it's an and also.
Unfortunately, we are doing a little bit shorter interviews this time. Dean Whitaker, thank you so much. What a ton of fun. I so appreciate it. I know you've got a million things going on. So thank you very much, sir.
My pleasure.